everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Harvester, a third-person point-and-click adventure title, developed by DigiFX Interactive and published by Merit Studios in 1996 for the MS-DOS and Windows computer platforms. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 141. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, awards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewall, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, Left-Handed Guitarist, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Super Smash Burger, Christopher Fose, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show, whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis. I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context. How was the game made? Why was the game made? And then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that. But we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and/or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go. But I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Harvester. Harvester is a third-person point-and-click adventure title developed by DigiFX Interactive and published by Merit Studios in 1996 for the MS-DOS and Windows computer platforms. Before we can talk about Harvester, we need to dive back into history to talk about some prevailing forces in the gaming industry that helped to influence Harvester's creation. Because, as we'll see, Harvester isn't just a simple point-and-click adventure game created by a man with a desire to share his creation with the world. It is, instead, a commentary on the perceived overreaction by the United States government to violence in video games, and is itself intended to shock, revolt, and sicken gamers. When your marketing pitch is basically, play this game to experience the utmost in depravity, you know you're in for a good time. Or maybe not. That, however, is getting ahead of ourselves, as before we can talk about whether Harvester is anything more than a blatant attempt to use controversy as a means for garnering sales, we need to talk about the creation of the game itself. Now, before we begin, I do need to give a special shout out to arguably the best collection of Harvester behind-the-scenes information, and potentially the only collection of Harvester behind-the-scenes info out there. There's a man named Arno Malin, who has a major Harvester fan site on Facebook, along with a Harvester YouTube show, both published as Lodge Level 4, that both have a ton of Harvester info. Certainly more info than I ever expected to find out about Harvester. Seriously, this guy has got to be the biggest Harvester fan out there, and I have got to give Malin credit for how many interviews, behind-the-scenes stories, and other related information he's been able to chronicle over the years. In fact, a fair amount of the content that we're going to talk about from a historical and development perspective comes directly from interviews that he's conducted and the different research that he has done. So, credit where credit is due. A lot of the discussion we're going to have today comes from the work Malin has done and the investigations he's undertaken, as far as tracking down different cast members, producers, and others involved in finding out additional information about Harvester. Because if you take a look at some of the common reference materials available online, like Wikipedia as an example, there are simply not many details out there. So Arno, if you happen to hear this, thank you for all of your work. Your site and YouTube show were both great resources as I dove deeper down a gore-filled rabbit hole to learn more about Harvester. Anyway, let's turn our attention to the game itself. Only here, we need to take a bit of a detour even before we start. In order to truly understand why Harvester came to be, we need to look at the video game industry of the early 90s, which was a period of time when video games were rapidly gaining mainstream popularity, driven both by the traditional experiences that gamers in the 80s had enjoyed, combined with brand new gaming experiences that were designed to exploit newer technologies that had been introduced to the market. While gaming in the 80s was filled with pixel graphics and cartoony designs, the early 90s saw companies begin to experiment with digitizing different imagery to create more realistic experiences, whether that meant adding in real-world location-based photos to various titles, or potentially adding digitized versions of real people, some of them even actors, into games. And with that newfound technology, video games started to branch out beyond what had traditionally been known as children's entertainment, to instead begin touching upon more mature themes, using then modern technology to make games look and feel more real. Now, I should be clear. There have always been games that depicted mature subject matter, even as far back as late 70s and early 80s. The thing is, though, most of those more mature-themed games were decidedly not mainstream. Sure, you might find a copy of the latest arcade Laserdisc strip poker release at a casino. Or you might find any number of questionable and downright offensive unlicensed games for the Atari 2600. Or you might even wander into the underground computer scene of the 80s, where any and all topics were possible fodder for independently created interactive experiences. But despite the existence of mature content-themed games in the early days of the video and computer game industry, these style of games were absolutely not prevalent in the industry, and were certainly not marketed alongside titles like Super Mario Bros., Pong, and Dragon's Lair. And even though games may have existed with mature themes since the dawn of the industry, the limitations of the technology available at the time meant that, for the most part, the visuals and gameplay for those games were still unable to recreate the level of realism necessary to make people think that the games would pose a true hazard to any young individuals who may happen to stumble upon them. But as the early 90s approached and the degree of realism in gaming reached previously unexpected heights, video games could no longer fly under the radar as merely children's entertainment, especially as developers began tackling more mature themes in increasingly mainstream releases. And with that expanded focus, video game developers and their releases began to attract some additional attention, not just from a broader game-playing public made up of new gamer demographics, but also from governmental agencies who became concerned that the youth of the day were going to become corrupted by unscrupulous developers trying to sell mature content to children. At the time, the video game industry was effectively unregulated, in that there was nothing preventing someone of any age from purchasing and playing any game that might be sitting on a store shelf. Unlike the movie industry, which had implemented a series of ratings to help restrict access to more mature films from younger children, the gaming industry did not have any analogous system in place, which was fine when store shelves were lined with copies of Mega Man, Mario Bros., and The Legend of Zelda. When stores started carrying games like Night Trap, Doom, and Mortal Kombat, though, that was deemed to be a major issue. And incidentally, two of those titles in particular, Night Trap and Mortal Kombat, would be at the center of a major political event in 1993 here in the United States, and one that would end up changing the face of the gaming industry forever. Mortal Kombat, as most are likely aware, is a fighting game that was originally released in the arcades back in 1992. And would represent one of the first times that digitized actors were used in an arcade title. Not the first, mind you, but certainly one of the earliest examples of digitized actors in a video game, which by itself wasn't a big deal. What was a big deal, however, was the fact that these digitized actors were punching, kicking, and ripping the hearts out of each other's chests, complete with a degree of blood-splattering violence that was simply unheard of in the early 90s. Now certainly, if you look at the game from a modern perspective, the violence in Mortal Kombat is incredibly tame in comparison to what you see nowadays, but back in 1992, there was simply nothing like it. The Sega CD titled Night Trap, which incidentally was released just 1 week after Mortal Kombat hit arcades, would take things even further. Night Trap is a full-motion video game, meaning that beyond just having digitized sprites of real people on the screen, you now had actual actors performing various roles in what amounted to a filmed interactive movie, with some scenes depicting traditional 1980s-era slumber party antics with a bunch of teenage girls, some of which would ultimately be attacked by blood-sucking creatures known as augurs throughout the game's playtime. Similar to Mortal Kombat, the content in Night Trap, when compared to the majority of games released today, was decidedly tame. But when you compare Night Trap to nearly any other pixel art-based title from the time, it was absolutely something that made people stand up and take notice. In December of 1993, those two titles, Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, along with other more mature-themed games, would be the impetus behind a joint Senate Judiciary and Government Affairs Committee hearing, where various politicians and game designers would discuss, at length, the issue of violence in video games, with the eventual result of that investigation being the creation of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, or ESRB, in July of 1994. The ESRB would be responsible for assigning content ratings to video games in much the same way as the Motion Picture Association of America governed film content ratings. The thought being that as games continued to deal with more mature subject matter, such a rating system would prevent younger players from being exposed to that content, unless a parent purchased those games for their children themselves. Similar ratings boards would pop up around the world, with some countries being more strict than others. But the bottom line is, as games and the technology behind them continued to mature, so too did the need to regulate access to games that, for one reason or another, presented situations that were not deemed suitable for younger players. For the most part, the game industry took this new rating system in stride, with developers agreeing to abide by the newly defined guidelines, even if for some it meant a perceived attack on their freedom of speech. I wanted to talk through that historical perspective for one very specific reason. In January of 1994, at the Las Vegas Consumer Electronics Show, or CES, several months before the ESRB would be formalized, but following the initial government inquiries into the violence in video games, a new game would be announced to the public, one that would be designed from the ground up to be one of the most violent, over-the-top, mature titles to ever be seen on a computer screen. That game, as envisioned by former Origin Systems game designer Gil Austin, would be intended to push the boundaries of good taste, while at the same time acting as a commentary against the censorship that was about to be imposed upon the video game industry. That game, as you might have guessed, was Harvester. As Austin was attending the 1994 CES, he looked at the changes happening in the video game industry and became incredibly frustrated at what he believed was an attempt by the US government to restrict the free speech of video game designers. Rather than take the situation lying down, though, he decided to go in a different direction, basically telling the government that if they thought Mortal Kombat and Night Trap were bad, well, they hadn't seen anything yet. Harvester as a concept originated well before the 1994 CES, as Austin began working with a small development studio named Future Vision, a company that had released a couple games previously but were not, by any stretch of the imagination, big-name players in the video game and computer game industry. Austin had scheduled a meeting with Future Vision where he was going to pitch his idea for a new, envelope-pushing game with a small enough scope to be achievable with a relatively modest budget, but with a concept so highbrow and potentially impactful that Austin believed it would take the gaming world by storm, offering a much more intellectually stimulating and thought-provoking experience than the majority of games released by mainstream game publishers. Austin knew that he couldn't compete with major game studios in terms of budget or industry reach. But if he could create an experience that made people think, and perhaps stirred up some controversy, then maybe he could overcome his status as a small-scale game designer to potentially make a bigger splash than anyone expected. Anyway, Austin pitched his concept to Future Vision, and luckily for him, the company was totally on board. It did not take long before Future Vision agreed to work with Austin to develop Harvester, with publishing partner Merit Studios providing the funding needed to bring Austin's vision of an ultra-violent, over-sexualized, and hopefully controversial interactive experience to life. With a $1 million budget in hand, Austin went to the 1994 CES and unveiled Harvester to the world. Though it's important to recognize that at this point in our story, Harvester was simply a concept with a very high-level prototype comprised of crudely drawn characters and animations. There wasn't any playable gameplay. There wasn't any real game structure in place yet. In fact, Austin didn't even know what mix of technologies his final game was going to leverage. All Austin knew was that he wanted to create a game that would make the entire world collectively gasp at what he hoped would be the most violent and offensive interactive experience ever made. Following Harvester's showing at CES, Austin had high hopes, as he felt that the majority of showgoers were totally bought into the concept behind Harvester, and he fully believed that he was on the path to creating an amazing game. Interestingly, not everyone from the Harvester team who attended the show shared that same level of optimism, but one thing was undeniable. Harvester had definitely garnered a bunch of attention, primarily because of the game's mature focus and bold claims that it was going to be one of the most offensive games ever created. The only question was, beyond delivering a controversial experience, which was effectively a guarantee at this point, what kind of game would Harvester actually end up being? Well, it didn't take long before Austin and the team decided that in order to deliver the most realistic depictions of violence and gore, Harvester would have to utilize the most realism-focused technology available to game designers of the time, which meant Harvester was going to have to be made as a full-motion video or FMV title, complete with real actors portraying various individuals that inhabited the game's world, pre-recorded cutscenes to advance the plot at certain key points throughout the game, and a fully voice-acted script with digitized actors for every single character in the game. The thought was, making Harvester as an FMV title would allow the game's development team to create the equivalent of an interactive movie, or at least utilize various techniques that film studios had perfected over the years in order to deliver the most realistic levels of gore possible in a computer game. Bringing the world of Harvester to life would require the creation of a small 1950s-era town, which perhaps unsurprisingly was named Harvest, modeled after real-world buildings and locations in order to once again immerse players in the realism of the title, as well as the use of chroma key technology to combine digitized actors with pre-rendered computer imagery, a technique that had been used frequently in film and television, but was still somewhat new in the video and computer game industry. Using a previously unused space in the Merit Studios office building, green screens were set up, cameras were purchased, and various scenes would be acted out that would eventually make their way into the game, with Gil Austin himself directing all of the action, while at the same time being responsible for nearly every aspect of the game from a creative perspective, including the script, storyline, and overarching themes that he hoped to convey to the game-playing public. What this means is that if you play Harvester at some point in your gaming careers, you are definitely playing Gil Austin's game, and the content throughout the entire experience, while being somewhat influenced by others, is ultimately Austin's unique vision. Interestingly, when Austin said that he wanted to make the most offensive and vulgar game anyone had ever seen, he really meant it. So much so that some of the creative decisions Austin had made were soundly rejected by Merit Studios as a contingency for remaining the game's publishing partner. Some of Austin's ideas that were ultimately scrapped included the ability to allow players to kill a baby, a sequence involving mother-daughter incest, multiple scenes of topless female nudity, and a late-game sequence showing a female being repeatedly sexually assaulted by a robotic machine as she was restrained on a table, just to name a few of the sequences Austin thought were, and I quote, high concept. As luck would have it, none of those ideas would ever see the light of day, as Merit Studios put their foot down and basically said that there was no way they were going to publish a game that involved such a degree of offensive content. Merit Studios was fine with over-the-top violence, and they didn't oppose to a degree of sexual content being included with the title, as they knew Harvester was targeting a very strong mature rating. But some of those ideas? No, I take that back. All of those ideas? Those were a bit too much for Austin's publishing partner. Despite not being able to get every piece of content he wanted into the game, Austin was mostly happy with his creative contributions to the title, and by the fall of 1994, the storyline was complete, the filming had finished, and the general narrative flow was finalized. The only thing left to do was have the game's programmers and other technical team members stitch together the various sequences into a cohesive playable experience. At the time, Austin felt confident that the game would be completed and released by the end of the year, which was the game's targeted release date for a couple of different reasons. For one, Austin wanted to be able to release the game as close to the height of the controversy surrounding violence in video games as possible, as like we talked about, Austin effectively wanted to give a virtual middle finger to the ratings board and government regulators who were imposing what he believed to be restrictions on his own freedom of speech. And secondly, though perhaps as important, Austin recognized that mega publisher and adventure game behemoth Sierra Online was readying their own FMV-styled mature adventure game, Phantasmagoria, designed by the grandmother of the graphical adventure game herself, Roberta Williams. Sierra had a significantly higher budget, a much larger and more experienced staff, and, of course, had name recognition that far exceeded Future Vision as a company, which incidentally would be renamed to DigiFX during Harvester's production, further making it so that the creators behind Harvester would have next to no recognizable industry relevance, at least in the eyes of most gamers. Austin figured that the only way to really compete with Sierra was to beat them to the punch, to release an even more offensive game before Sierra could complete Phantasmagoria, and hopefully steal the mature gamer market before Sierra even knew what hit them. With visions of dominating the market and selling countless copies of his game, Austin stepped away from Harvester's production, confident that the technical team under the direction of producer Lee Jacobson would turn his creative vision into a reality in relatively short order. Unfortunately for Austin, however, that confidence would turn out to be misplaced. Rather than releasing in 1994 as planned, work on Harvester would end up finishing in 1996, a full 2 years after the original planned release date, and a whole year after Sierra's own gothic horror title Phantasmagoria hit the market, selling over 1 million copies and proving that there was, in fact, a market for mature-oriented adventure games. Unfortunately, it's not entirely clear what caused the 2-year delay from Harvester's intended release date to when it finally hit the market, though Gil Austin, for his part, certainly has some opinions. He has been very vocal for a very long time about his belief that Lee Jacobson failed miserably in driving the game to completion, and Austin has further noted that he believes the game's technical team was grossly incompetent, as evidenced in their inability to develop the underlying technology that would allow Harvester to come out in 1994. Obviously, I wasn't there, so I don't have any first-hand knowledge of what actually happened. What I can say, though, is that from the outside looking in, it definitely seems like Austin may have been a bit too ambitious for his own good, and perhaps didn't fully understand what it took to make an actual playable game. He understood the creative aspects of game design just fine, but how to develop a game engine, script various events and encounters, create a user interface, and tie everything together? I'm not entirely convinced Austin understood that aspect of game development. Regardless of what happened or didn't happen, work on Harvester would eventually complete in late 1996, with the game releasing in September of that year in North America and a European release following shortly thereafter. And considering the hype behind the title from several years prior, and Phantasmagoria's own success, hopes were still high that Harvester, despite being delayed for 2 years, would still make waves in the market. Unfortunately for All and Bob, though, that is absolutely not what would end up happening. Upon its release, Harvester would be met with decidedly mediocre reviews, with most critics praising the game's absolutely bonkers level of gore and violence, which for many made the game feel like a fun B-movie styled experience, while those same critics also declared that the game's narrative, structure, dialogue, and characters all at the end of the day didn't make a lick of sense. There was recognition that Harvester had attempted to do something different, but as far as actually succeeding in delivering a must-play experience, Harvester had not hit the mark. With such a tepid critical response, the team behind the game did the only thing they could possibly do to help drive sales, which was to double down on the controversy surrounding the game, with Lee Jacobson in particular taking every opportunity to attempt to get people to talk about Harvester, even if those discussions would be driving negative attention. According to Jacobson, as long as people were talking about the game, it didn't matter if they were praising it or calling it the most offensive piece of interactive media they had ever played. At the end of the day, any attention was better than no attention. This attempt to harness the power of controversy was nowhere more evident than in December of 1996, which is when a man named Dr. David Walsh released a list of the most violent video games that were available on the market, viewed as a sort of follow-up to the congressional hearings from several years prior. When Walsh released that list of violent titles, one thing struck Jacobson as odd. Surprisingly, Harvester was nowhere to be found on that list. Rather than let that perceived defense slide, Jacobson reached out to Walsh directly and effectively told him that his list was bogus because Harvester wasn't on it. Jacobson went out of his way to suggest, in no uncertain terms, that Harvester should absolutely be added to the list, and any failure to recognize Harvester as one of the most violent games ever made was an incredibly short-sighted decision by Walsh and his research team. Unlike nearly every violent game from past years that attempted to reduce governmental and regulator attention, Jacobson wanted Harvester to be the poster child for violence in video games, in the hopes that stirring up that controversy would lead to ever-increasing sales. Much to Jacobson's chagrin, Walsh never did augment his list of violent games, and many journalists and publications intentionally avoided talking about Harvester, the company behind the game, or Jacobson himself, as many believed Jacobson's actions to be exceedingly shameless. While Harvester would never drive any sort of significant controversy around the time of its release, mainly because it arrived after the whole violence in video games and debate had subsided, at least temporarily, it would end up being banned entirely in Germany, an outcome that Jacobson, somewhat strangely, looked at as a badge of honor. Considering Germany's love of point-and-click adventure titles and the potential sales that could have come from that particular country, I do find Jacobson's behavior somewhat strange. But hey, I suppose he had his reasons. Anyway, for years following Harvester's release, it failed to really gain any sort of mainstream attention, despite Jacobson's best efforts, and for a long time, it seemed like Harvester was going to be a one-and-done kind of game release, and truly something that would end up as a footnote in gaming history. Interestingly though, that would end up not being the case, as in 2014, the game would be re-released on both GOG and Steam, and in the process, modern internet personalities had a chance to experience Harvester for the first time. And given the game's unique blend of campy acting, full-motion video, over-the-top violence, and somewhat questionable design decisions, Harvester would end up becoming much more well-known today, a full 29 years after its original release. It may not have stirred up as much controversy as its creators intended back in 1996, but for many gamers today, Harvester is, if not controversial, certainly a title that is so bad it's good. A somewhat surprising twist of fate for a game that for years appeared to be destined for 100% mediocrity. While I'll relay my own opinion of the game in just a little bit, the fact is that in the eyes of many, Harvester is a title that definitely deserves some degree of recognition. As a mostly failed attempt at commentary on the debate surrounding violence in video games, Harvester succeeded in delivering an offensive, often tasteless experience that would surprisingly not drive as much controversy as any of its creators intended, much to their collective disappointment. Whether you or I personally enjoy the game, or find it repulsive, is mostly irrelevant, as Harvester remains an important, if somewhat flawed release in gaming history, and as such is definitely a title that deserves to be remembered. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Harvester today versus when it was released almost 30 years ago. In many ways, Harvester is a fairly traditional point-and-click adventure title, especially in terms of the game's general mechanics and gameplay, in which you control a character from a third-person perspective who can interact with the environment, converse with other characters, pick up items, and solve various puzzles scattered about the game world. And hearing that description, and even playing the game for a few minutes, you'd be forgiven for assuming that Harvester is simply another point-and-click adventure title, released during a time in computer history when adventure games were still a popular genre amongst a broader population of gamers. The simple fact, though, is that Harvester is not simply a traditional adventure game, and as we'll see, it takes fairly traditional adventure game mechanics and does its own thing with them, while also introducing its own unique gameplay into the mix, all of which serves to make Harvester both similar to other point-and-click adventures, while also being its own unique experience. To start, let's take a look at the general interface for the game, which will be instantly familiar to most anyone who has ever played a point-and-click adventure title before. As with all of those titles, you interact with the game world using your mouse, with a left click allowing you to examine any item or hotspot within the game world, which will occasionally lead to a second potential action for a given object, like interact or pick up. As an example, let's say you see a light switch on a nearby wall. No matter what you do, the first time you mouse over that light switch, your icon will be a magnifying glass, and left-clicking that switch will display some sort of examine text on the screen. Once you do that, though, your mouse over icon will change to a turning gear, indicating that there's an extra action you can take with that light switch, which in this instance is to use it. This kind of multi-step interactivity applies to every object and hotspot in the game, meaning in order to actually use or pick up something, you must always examine it first. There is no quicker way, to the best of my knowledge, to switch from one action to the next, short of progressing from examine to whatever the next interaction for a given object might be. This is a design decision that I'm on the fence about, though overall, I think it was a bad idea on the part of the game's development team. While I appreciated the focus on delivering additional item and hotspot details through the Examine feature, I really dislike losing the autonomy of choosing my own actions when interacting with various objects, and forcing me to examine something before I interact with it, while conceptually not a huge deal, makes it so that you effectively need to examine everything in a scene before you even realize what is interactable or not, which is, at that point, told explicitly to you, removing any independent thought from what you may or may not decide to try to do with a given object or hotspot. This is too much hand-holding from my perspective without appreciable gain, and overall, I was not a fan of this style of interaction. Now, some of you might be wondering why the game's developers didn't use the right mouse button as an alternate action kind of control scheme, or perhaps to cycle through available actions. Well, the answer to that question has to do with what that right mouse button's purpose truly is in Harvester, which is, surprisingly, combat. Yes, you heard that right. Harvester, as a point-and-click adventure game, has the right mouse button devoted exclusively to combat, and our longtime listeners will likely know what I'm about to say next, which is, this was a very questionable design decision for me as I started playing the game, because I've gone on record multiple times before as being highly critical of adventure games that attempt to integrate combat into the otherwise slower-paced engines that these games utilize. Adventure game engines, generally speaking, are not designed to deliver a worthwhile combat experience, and even adventure titles that are otherwise stellar experiences are oftentimes let down by any combat mechanics they attempt to use in the context of their game. My question, realizing that Harvester has an entire button dedicated to combat, is whether Harvester could buck the trend of most adventure games by offering combat that in some way wouldn't suck. The answer to that question is actually more complex than it would first appear, and the reason for that complexity has to do with how Harvester handles combat, and how that combat is integrated into the overall experience of playing the game. First though, I should mention that a good chunk of the non-player characters you find throughout the game can in fact be attacked and killed, a degree of open-ended gameplay that I truly didn't expect as I was playing the game. And that combat, luckily, is simple enough. All you have to do is rapidly right-click your mouse, and you'll execute an attack using whatever weapon you may have equipped, or your fists if you don't have any weapons equipped at the time. Kind of like an adventure game equivalent to a Diablo-styled action experience. And there are a surprising number of items in the game that can act as both weapons and puzzle solutions, which honestly was something I found intriguing at first glance. And each weapon you use actually has unique animations associated with your attacks, with some even doing more damage than others. And there are even ranged weapons in the game, like shotguns and nail guns, which will allow you to attack enemies from across the screen. I will freely admit that seeing the amount of time and focus spent creating this bolt-on combat system to augment traditional point-and-click adventure gameplay really did surprise me, as it was clear that the combat mechanics here were not simply throwaway efforts. The combat was well integrated into the game, and seemed to be a core staple of the overall game's design. Which is why it's so unfortunate that actually attacking someone sucks as much as it does. I had high hopes when I realized that the combat mechanics were seemingly more detailed than other point-and-click adventures, only to be let down by execution that felt so bad to use that I once again need to reiterate that combat in point-and-click adventure games should almost never be a thing. I'll give you an example of how combat might play out. Let's say you enter a room where there's a hostile enemy. Well, he or she will start walking towards you using a form of oddly animated movement that will make you think of Mortal Kombat if Mortal Kombat suddenly lost the ability to animate its characters with any semblance of realism. As that hostile enemy approaches you, you'll have to decide what you want to attack with. So you go into your inventory by left-clicking on your character, scan your items to see what you want to equip, and finding a suitable weapon, right-click it, which will arm it on your character. As you return to the normal screen, you'll then begin spamming right-click immediately, because attempting to move in this game is not something that comes naturally, as only certain parts of the environment can actually be walked on, which is a design paradigm I really dislike in third-person adventures. Clicking around the screen to move while not in combat often produces no results, so trying to click and move while in combat is almost never a good idea. Anyway, you begin spamming your right mouse button, and as the enemy approaches you, you'll either hit him, or you won't, and they will either hit you, or they won't, and eventually, one of you will die. That's honestly the flow of combat, in that it is so basic and so uninspired that I fail to understand how anyone could actually enjoy fighting anyone or anything in Harvester. Now, I do have to give the design team some credit, because each weapon can be aimed in one of 3 different directions, like high, middle, and low, and each weapon does have its own characteristics that impact how they work in combat, like how scythes are longer than, say, a baseball bat, and will therefore give your attacks greater range, which can increase your survivability. But the simple fact is that fighting in Harvester is not fun. And despite the additional mechanics that show some thought was placed into the combat portion of the experience, the execution of those ideas fall entirely flat on their face. The good news is that required combat is very limited throughout a good chunk of the game, meaning there will almost never be a sequence in the game that requires combat in order to progress. Until that is the final section of the game, which we'll talk about in a little bit. For the majority of the game, though, combat is entirely optional, meaning you will not wander into an area and be randomly attacked by someone or something, which at the end of the day is a very good thing, and is something I appreciated. Something I also appreciated is the fact that combat can, in certain circumstances, be used as a solution to certain puzzles, or perhaps more accurately, as a way of short-circuiting certain puzzle chains by simply killing the source of that puzzle in the first place. The first time I experienced one of these situations where I ended up killing someone to take their item as opposed to finding the quote-unquote proper solution to acquire that item, I thought to myself, this can't possibly be right. I assumed I was going to face some significant repercussions for my murderous ways, because there's no way the game would let me do this and get away with it, right? Only nope, no repercussions. The game was totally fine with me killing that guy and taking their item. I recognized there was a better way to acquire that item, or at least a less violent way, but I was surprised that the game allowed me an alternate approach, even if it meant that I was effectively embracing my more sociopathic instincts. So then I started wondering myself, well, just how open-ended is this game really? Because if the game was actually responsive to your actions, such that you could kill any individual in the game world and the game would keep on going regardless, I was about to be seriously impressed. So, I walked up to the nearest innocent bystander, took out my trusty baseball bat, and took a few swings, for science. And for a few seconds after that unsuspecting victim's death, the game played on, seemingly oblivious that I had just committed murder. Only then, the game recognized that I did in fact commit a crime, and I was unceremoniously arrested and sentenced to death for my crimes, which was accompanied by a cheesy FMV cutscene depicting my execution by electric chair, before being presented with a game over screen and forced to reload a prior save. Oh well, at least I tried. Ultimately, I appreciated the fact that certain puzzle chains included in the game had alternate violent and non-violent approaches, though I really wish that the game was designed to be more open-ended in allowing for more potential alternate solutions for different situations that you might face in the game. The bigger issue from my perspective is the fact that regardless of what you do in these multiple path kinds of situations, the game won't actually respond with any degree of meaningful narrative shift, or more broadly, any sort of repercussions whatsoever. There are numerous examples of where the game totally drops the ball here, like when you have the option of blackmailing a specific character, which, as you might expect, is not looked at kindly by that character at all. Or, more accurately, it's not looked at kindly in the moment, because the very next time you speak with that now blackmailed character, they return to their default cheery interactions with you, which honestly is a major issue that served to impact the overall immersion and continuity of Harvester's story. I'm not saying the game should have had divergent paths, multiple endings, and significant narrative branching based on my choices, because I was pretty darn sure this wasn't the kind of game that was going to have any degree of player agency. But I would have expected some impact to my actions, and as it stands, that was entirely absent, other than a throwaway interaction or set of dialogues that ultimately had no impact on the rest of the game. This issue is even prevalent during normal quest chains, where every time you accomplish a major quest in the game, each character in the game world is updated with some form of recognition that you completed that quest, before returning to a set of default interactions. Even after some pretty crazy interactions, the next time you interact with a character, they basically reset themselves, seemingly unaware of what just happened. The most egregious example of this happening involves a kidnapping, where you discover the person responsible and confront them about the situation. That discussion goes about as well as you would expect, and I assumed, wrongly, that there would be some lasting impact to future dialogues. Only nope. The next time I spoke to that person, they treated me like I was their favorite person in the world. This felt so odd, and is something that, from my perspective, showed a lack of follow-through by the game's designers that I was not a fan of. The dialogue system itself, outside of the odd goldfish-like memories of each character in the game, is interesting, which is to say, it had potential, but ultimately failed to do anything meaningful to advance the state of adventure game character interaction. When you speak with someone, you're presented with a set of topics to potentially discuss, as well as a text box at the bottom of the dialog window where you could potentially type in your own topic for the computer to respond to. When I first saw this, my immediate thought was, okay, cool, the game is giving me some default topics, but I can do my own detective work to learn even more about what's going on. The reality of the situation, though, is that the text box is simply there to make up for the rest of the dialogue system's poor design. You know how in most adventure games you're presented with a list of topics, and as you talk through each one, they either get removed from the list or get a line put through them or become dimmer than the other remaining topics to discuss? Well, in Harvester, that never happens, which by itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. The issue, however, is that the topic list is determined by the last thing the person you're speaking with just said, which means the topic list is ever changing from one moment to the next. And if you fail to make note of the individual potential topics earlier in a conversation, it's possible you'll never even realize that a specific topic is available to be discussed. As an example, let's say I walk up to someone and begin speaking with them. After that first interaction, their topic list might read something like the lodge, mom, dad, and school. Okay, cool. 4 topics to explore. Now, let's say I decide to talk about mom. I select that topic, get some sort of response, and after that response, the topic list now reads dad, sick, and meat. Well, if I didn't remember that the lodge and school were previously available topics from that first list, I might never even think to ask this person about them. And it's not like returning to the person resets their topic list. It truly is possible that you miss out on a topic if you're not observant enough. To combat this, I started writing down every discrete topic that appeared in any topic list before I started diving deeper into a specific topic. That way, I was able to return to those potentially overlooked topics, which is where the open text box field comes in, as it allows you to type in a topic that might not be in the topic list currently, and potentially get a response from the person you're speaking with. The unfortunate thing is that the text box input seems to be 100% limited to topics that will at some point or another appear on the formal topic list for a person, so there's not really much opportunity for players to form their own line of questioning outside of what the game gives you explicitly. I tried some pretty standard and pretty crazy inputs in that text box, and only got an unexpected reply in one singular instance throughout the entire game. Which was honestly surprising, because what I put into the box was incredibly abnormal and actually repulsive, yet the game thought to include a specific response to the specific word I used with the specific person I was conversing with, which I guess says something? I don't know, the whole situation was weird, and I will not say specifically what situation I was in or what word I used that generated a unique in-game response that seemingly wasn't tied to a quote-unquote real topic. What I will say, though, is that it is super strange that this one topic was accounted for by the game's designers, but other more straightforward topics were met with the equivalent of an I don't know anything about that response from the game's characters. Anyway, putting aside taboo topics and odd design decisions, the fact is that the game's dialogue system fell short of my expectations, and in some ways took a step back from the more traditional dialogue mechanics present in other adventure games. I appreciate when a developer tries something different, but similar to some of my other critiques thus far, this just feels like a half-hearted effort. Also half-hearted was the way that full motion video would integrate into the game, including the very brief cutscenes that will sometimes play at different points when you're talking to someone. For those who may not know, I love full motion video in gaming, from the schlockiest B-movie performances to the most well-produced Hollywood-level spectacles. For a good chunk of games, even when the FMV is bad, I still love it, simply because I am that big of an FMV fan. Which is to say, the fact that Harvester uses FMV should make me like it more than I otherwise would. The issue there is, the FMV in Harvester is used so haphazardly that it felt too much like a distraction most of the time, rather than something to appreciate. And I'm not even talking about the quality of the FMV sequences or the acting in those scenes. I'm talking purely about the technical aspect of how FMV was integrated into the game. Let's say you're talking with someone and you hit upon a topic that has some sort of FMV cutscene associated with it. Well, what happens is you click that dialogue topic, the person you're speaking with says something, and then the screen goes black as the cutscene loads. The cutscene then plays, which oftentimes is literally a 2-second clip of some action or object that is absolutely meaningless and doesn't warrant a cutscene at all, after which the game reloads the dialogue screen and you're free to talk about whatever other topic you want to explore. My issue here is not with the fact that certain dialogues load a cutscene. It's that the cutscenes included in the game are so short and of so little value to the rest of the game that they appear as though they were included just because. Here, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're talking to a teacher about how she chooses to discipline her students. Well, at a certain point in that conversation, you'll get shown a 2-second cutscene of a pre-rendered dunce cap and a bloody baseball bat, which is just like, okay, whatever. I mean, I get it. I just question the actual benefit that cutscene added to the overall experience of playing the game. And honestly, that example was probably one of the better examples of a cutscene integrated into the game, which is definitely saying something. That being said, there are some longer cutscenes that play at certain key points in the story, like one of the unsexiest sex scenes that you'll ever see in a piece of media, one of the craziest moments of violence where a baby's eyeballs literally pop out of its head, and one of the most uncomfortable scenes I've personally witnessed in a game, where the sheriff of the town tucks you into bed before giving you a kiss, despite the fact that the sheriff is not related to you at all, and the fact that you're effectively a grown adult. And speaking of being uncomfortable, the majority of the game feels designed from the ground up to make you feel uneasy, uncomfortable, and downright icky while playing it. I don't think I've ever played a game that made me feel so gross while playing it, and not because of overt gore or violence, though there's plenty of that too. No, for me, this was more the general characters in the game, all of whom seem designed to intentionally make your skin crawl as you go to your children to warn them never to approach someone that looks or behaves like these people. I'm not being hyperbolic. The level of ick in this game is off the charts, and when you combine that ickiness with the questionable acting, story, plot devices, and general over-the-top nature of the whole experience, you're left with something that, from my perspective, really takes some effort to get through. We'll talk more about why that is in just a couple minutes. But first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box. Because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have a ton of gameplay videos we could look up. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was often based on word of mouth from family and friends, magazine reviews we might have read, and what the box actually looked like. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Harvester, for the DOS and Windows computer platform, the back of the box says, Harvester. You wake up one morning to a town full of strangers and inexplicable sights. You share your home with your not-so-perfect family, and your supposed fiancé lives next door. Then you are plunged into a nightmare. Your fiancé is missing, and you find a hideous bloody skull and spinal cord draped across her bed. Is it hers? What's going on? The only clue left behind is an engraved invitation for you to enter the Order of the Harvest Moon, a mysterious organization that controls the town in ways you don't or can't understand. Is the Order behind this gruesome execution? What are their motives? One thing is certain, you're going to get to the bottom of this killing, or die trying. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box that show some gore, some FMV things, and I've got to say, by itself, this back of the box actually does sell me on the title. It actually sounds interesting. It sounds intriguing. It sounds like something I would have enjoyed playing and trying to figure out the mystery behind. I highly question, having known the game and having played the game, I highly question the text on the back of the box because, in fact, the text on the back of the box refers to an incredibly late game event after you've already played the game for hours. The thing with the girlfriend or the fiance and the spinal cord and the skull and all that kind of stuff, that is literally effectively the penultimate sequence in the game. It's the thing that leads into the final end game sequence. And you've done so many things before then that I can't believe. I mean, this is like, they spoil their own game on the back of the box. And I know I don't usually spoil things, but the freaking game company, the designers behind the game, the publishing partner, they spoiled the game on the box. It's not my fault. I simply read the back of the box. I cannot believe how incompetent that text was in order to be included on the box. I don't think I've ever had a situation where a company literally spoiled their own game on their own box. It's not like that event was the beginning of the game and kicked off all of the sequences of things that happened. It's literally near the end of the game. Well, all I can say is the box by itself, if I didn't know the game, the box by itself would definitely sell me. Knowing the game and what it is, I find this to be highly questionable. And it's something that I am still scratching my head. I don't understand how a game company could have possibly done this. Anyway, we're going to move on from talking about the back of the box to talking about the more specific aspects of the game. And we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Harvester are a bit of a mixed bag, with generally subpar environmental and character graphics coupled with higher than expected quality filmed FMV sequences, overlaid on top of mid-90s pre-rendered computer-generated imagery, which, while not horrible, certainly shows its age. I'm not suggesting that the graphics are bad, they're just very much dated. And because stylistically the team went for a more realism-based approach to the game and its general artistic design, the game doesn't have the benefit of relying on a more visually distinctive style to overcome the advances in graphics technology that have become commonplace over the years. The visuals here run the gamut from Microsoft Paint level quality to fairly good-looking imagery, with the biggest issue being the lack of consistency, which makes the whole thing feel fairly random. As an example, like I mentioned, the filmed sequences themselves are fairly high quality, in that the recorded video is more detailed than a good chunk of the FMV titles that you may have played from around the same time. That technical proficiency in filming, however, is marred by the graphics that are sometimes overlaid over that film, like the various sequences of gore and violence that turn a well-filmed FMV sequence into an amateurish effort that makes it look like someone was first learning how to use a video editing suite and decided to make their version of a bloody Halloween movie. Seriously, the visuals here are so wildly different in quality, oftentimes in the same scene, that you'll likely begin questioning why someone didn't try to drive some consistency here. More consistently bad are the game's animations, and in particular the walking animations that accompany the rare times when a character needs to walk across the screen. These animations, which use digitized actors in sprite form, are universally poor, with a very strange set of animated keyframes that make the whole thing feel oddly computer-generated and not at all natural. The speed, motion, and general appearance of the animations are just odd, so it's probably a good thing that most scenes in the game feature a fairly limited ability to walk around. Overall, the visuals in Harvester are mediocre, trending towards being simply poorer than I would like. There are some redeeming qualities, but not enough to outweigh the jankiness that pervades most visual elements in the game. Moving on to the music in Harvester is surprisingly decent, with a fair number of well-composed tracks that match the scenes being depicted on the screen surprisingly well, with some designed to increase tension, others designed to feel intentionally out of place, while others still create an actual, albeit minor, emotional response due to how effectively they're integrated with the sequence of events playing out on the screen. I don't think I would ever listen to a song from Harvester outside of the game, simply because the music here is not designed to be an enjoyable standalone sort of experience, but that doesn't detract from the general quality of the music itself, which, especially compared to other aspects of the game's design, is pretty darn good. The voice acting, on the other hand, that's really rough. And while some characters were designed to have very specific voices, the acting behind those voices were middling at best, with most leaning towards caricature as opposed to actual real people. In a game with cartoon-styled visuals and characters, that might make sense, but Harvester uses fully digitized actors as its characters, which means you kinda expect these people to be, more real? Despite that, some of the performances were respectable, even if they sounded like someone I would never associate with in real life, but the majority were just not all that great from my perspective. Definitely a bit of a miss. Overall, the auditory environment in Harvester was, similar to the visuals, a bit of a mixed bag, though I'd probably rate the audio as higher overall quality than the visuals, if I were to compare those two elements of the game directly. Moving on to the narrative and story, in Harvester, you play as a young man named Steve, who awakens one day in the town of Harvest, with seemingly no memory of how he got here, or any recollection of the people who claim they are his family and friends. You fairly quickly learn that you will be marrying another resident of Harvest, Stephanie, and that between your family and hers, there's some general excitement for the upcoming wedding. After you meet Stephanie, however, you realize that she's in the same kind of predicament as you are, which is she feels totally out of place and like she doesn't belong, coupled with having no memory of her family or her surroundings. It doesn't take long before you realize that something is definitely amiss in the town of Harvest, and over the course of your playthrough, it's up to you to figure out what's going on and hopefully return to some semblance of a normal life. Along the way, you'll have to deal with a bunch of very strange characters, attempt to join a mysterious lodge whose initiation involves you taking part in a series of increasingly sociopathic pranks, and figure out why you and Stephanie are seemingly the only quote-unquote real people in the entire town. If you end up making your way through the lodge's initiation procedure, you may just find out all of the secrets that Harvest is hiding. If not, it's entirely possible you'll end up dead, or even worse, stuck in a Groundhog's Day-like loop of infinite awfulness. It's up to you to survive, and hopefully escape, Harvest. So this story, man, do I have some thoughts. First though, a quick discussion about the overall strangeness of everything going on in the town of Harvest. There is, in fact, a semi-satisfying explanation as to why things are so weird, why the inhabitants of the town are so bizarre, and why the majority of the game is filled with violence and gore. While I'm not going to discuss any spoilers today, other than the ones that the game box literally tell you about, I do feel like it's necessary to let you all know that yes, the game does have a point. And yes, the game does have a message. And yes, the game eventually explains everything that's happening in a mostly coherent and satisfying way, which I've got to say I did appreciate. That being said though, the way the story was delivered and the way that message was conveyed felt so amateur that it loses nearly all of the effectiveness that it would otherwise have hoped to achieve over the course of a playthrough. The game wants you to care about how it plays out, and it wants you to look at this story as some deep, thought-provoking narrative that will challenge your real-world preconceived notions of certain not-to-be-spoiled concepts. But the fact is, everything about the game's story, aside from the ending explanation, which is decent, is so ham-fisted that it feels less like a quality narrative with a point, and more like a high school writing assignment turned in by an edgelord teenager who wants to make a statement about the world in which he lives, something he believes is profound, but is instead totally sophomoric. I know that sounds harsh, because it is, and it's harsh because the story elements at play here really do not come together into something approaching the artistic vision that I know its authors desperately wanted to attain. I'm being serious. This is a super try-hard kind of narrative experience, and unfortunately, it mostly misses the mark. I mean, even the delivery of the story is kind of weird. The game is set up over a series of days, similar to how other adventure games have different chapters or days or acts or whatever unit of time designates a chunk of a given game. In and of itself, that's a totally fine construct to use with a game like this. And within those days, you have a day and night cycle, with the events of the day typically setting up some specific activity during the night that you need to accomplish. Okay, no issue, all good so far. The problem comes with the length of each day, where it's entirely possible that a single day's worth of story might take literally 2 minutes to complete, especially if you've explored the whole town during day one like I did, which means the remainder of the days are mainly revisiting locations to discover what changed. There's just not enough here for the day-to-day structure to really be worthwhile, and I'm not joking when I say a couple times, the game shifted from day to night after I completed a single activity. This lack of pacing hurts an already not great story, and as you probably have assumed, I was not impressed. Moving on to the playability and controls, we've already talked about most of the game's controls, mechanics, and playability already, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I do want to touch upon though, and something I teased earlier, is the game's combat system, and just how prevalent that combat system is during a playthrough of the game. Earlier, I mentioned that combat is used relatively sparingly for a good chunk of the game's playtime, which is good because it is not a great combat experience. What is less good though, is the fact that the entire ending sequence of the game, which is probably a good hour or more worth of content, is almost entirely combat-centric. And let me tell you, this does nothing but make the game a worse experience overall. I know what the designers were going for. Throw players into a combat gauntlet as the game crescendos, eventually reaching the ending sequence and ultimately finishing the game. Conceptually, I get it. But the combat is so half-baked that the whole hour-plus sequence feels like an exercise in frustration. Luckily, many of the combat encounters aren't really difficult, which helps to make the experience not quite as bad as it could have been. But then, you reach the final sequence of fights, both of which consist of enemies that can attack you at range, rather than relying on melee range combat. I'm going to paint you a picture. You're making your way through this gauntlet of pain, dealing with a bunch of different enemies and using your various weapons as effectively as possible. And outside of one relatively easy and low damaging encounter, every enemy you face is a melee-centric combatant. Now, the combat system is not good, which means that regardless of how quote-unquote skilled you may be, there's a very real chance that you'll take some random damage at various points, which is fine, as the game does give you some healing items along the way. But let's say you make it through most of the battles, and you've used all of your healing items, and to further assume you've used the majority of your own ranged weaponry's ammo. Well, what do you think happens when you enter the second to last room in the gauntlet, and you get assaulted by a ranged weapon-using apparition? If you guessed experience a horrible death, you'd be absolutely right. If you guessed experience a horrible death that might make you have to redo a good chunk of this ridiculous combat gauntlet, then you'd be even more right. Because the final set of ranged enemies you need to face in order to make it to the final ending of the game are so unfair if you don't have a solid amount of ranged ammo that you will almost certainly have to reload a previously saved game to attempt to better conserve your resources, which means, depending on when you use those weapons, you may have to replay over an hour's worth of painful combat just to be able to reach the end of the game. If you were more conservative and have a good chunk of shotgun shells or some other ranged ammo equivalent, you'll likely not have an issue. But for those of us who actually ended up using some of that weaponry on our way to the end of the game, you may find yourself in the equivalent of a soft-locked state. I very nearly needed to replay the entire ending gauntlet, only to get lucky with a very close call victory after attempting to get past the final battle for around 20 minutes, in a point-and-click adventure game. You all know I love games of all types, and difficulty isn't a turnoff for me. But arbitrary challenge because of poor design decisions is something I'm not a fan of, and that's exactly what you get with this final sequence in the game. Rather than crescendo to a satisfying finale, it ends up making you question life decisions, and if it wasn't for being so close to the end of the game, this is the kind of experience that might make people quit a game outright. Anyway, I don't want to belabor that point anymore. The bottom line is that Harvester does have some good qualities, almost all of which are overshadowed by poor design decisions that hamper, rather than enhance, how it feels to play the game. So, what is our verdict on Harvester? You know, I'm surprisingly a bit on the fence when it comes to Harvester, not because it's a good game. No, truly, this is not a high-quality experience. No, what I'm on the fence about is the promise of the game, and how that promise failed to translate into a meaningful gameplay experience. There are things that Harvester does well, and there are ideas that could have been really compelling if they were executed well. But unfortunately, quality execution is just not what Harvester is all about, which is why, for me, Harvester is a prime addition to our list of mediocre mentions. It's not without some degree of merit, and if you're a hardcore adventure gamer, you'll you'll probably find some good things here that might warrant a personal playthrough. For everyone else though, and even for us adventure game aficionados, I need to urge caution. This is the kind of experience that you will not walk away from with any degree of satisfaction. You may experience moments of thinking, oh, this isn't so bad, but those positive thoughts will likely be fleeting, which is unfortunate because, like I said, there is something here. It's just buried under a pile of poor design decisions and questionable gameplay mechanics, which is why, from my perspective, Harvester is undeniably deserving of its spot as the newest member in our collection of mediocre mentions. That was our episode on Harvester. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on WWF No Mercy. So feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on WWF No Mercy. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.